So I moved the magazines from the shelf behind me because they seem distracting to me. I don't know if they were distracting to you, but anyways, back there, no longer there. Okay, so Poe's review of Hawthorne's short stories is considered to be one of the founding documents of short story theory. Now, such a theory is not the focus of this class for reasons I'll explain, but it's an important element in the way that short stories have been discussed, and you'll need to know about it. Short story theory involves critical efforts to distinguish that which is unique or distinctive in short stories so as to set them aside as a separate field of academic study. Now, both Poe's fiction and the review that you read for today, or you will read for Wednesday, I suppose, are considered foundational documents in the field. Here's why, or here's what Poe had to say. For Poe, what was essential in the short story was the unity of effect. The novel may have several aims, but the story should have one and only one. The short story should be read all at once and without interruption. So in his mind, it should take a half hour to 2 hours to read. And you were not allowed to get up for any reason, apparently. Right? Well, you wouldn't be, because you would be so caught up in the story, you'd find it hard to put it down. And then all efforts of the writer should be directed at a singular purpose. No word should be wasted or outside that unity of effect. Okay, now you can see how that very clearly that theory would apply to Poe's own fiction. It's up to you to decide whether that is something that defines the short story as a whole. And following Poe, many other critics have aimed at defining formal features which set the short story apart, and they have endeavored to suggest ways of reading that are uniquely applicable to the short story. Now, I'll provide a link on this week's guide page that'll provide a helpful annotated bibliography of short story theory. There's a lot out there. Some of it's very good, don't get me wrong. But that said, I will not be teaching a lot of short story theory in this class because I have to say I don't find a lot of it persuasive. Because I don't believe that what we call the short story represents a necessarily unique form of writing that is wholly different from other forms. Right? Most novelists also write short fiction. Right? Most readers of short stories also read novels. Now, it's not that there aren't identifiable differences between these forms. It's just that these differences might not actually be all that important in the end. But what might be important, what I think is important, is that the definition of the short story, what it is, and the cultural role of short fiction is something that varies historically, and I think studying that can be very rewarding. For example, Poe laid out a very strict parameter for how long it should take to read a story, right? Half hour to 2 hours. Today, many short stories would fall outside of those boundaries, either being longer or shorter, but we would still consider them stories. In fact, just so we have some terminology in common, let's consider the many formats that could be considered a story today. I'm going to break them down by length, right? It's not a scientific definition by any means, and sometimes the particular word counts will vary, but I think it's a helpful guide to begin with. Now, the information on this slide comes from a website on fiction writing markets called duotrope.com. There's a link for it on the guide for this week. And you can see here that it distinguishes different types of fiction according to their length. Now, all of these categories, except the novel, of course, could be broadly considered short fiction or short stories, and we will have future classes that focus on flash fiction, focus on short story collections, but in general, I think this lays out the kinds of things people talk about today when they talk about the short story. Now again, what I believe is most significant and interesting about the short story is how its cultural role has changed over time. Is it a form of mass culture, or is it part of elite culture? Is it a detriment to education, or is the story actually a means of educating students? Is the story an important way that writers make a living? Can they sell their fiction on the open market? Or is the story a way that a writer makes a reputation, which then may allow that writer to make a living? These are the kind of questions that I think are really fascinating, and they're the ones that will really animate this semester. Okay, the Tom Waits music actually has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I don't really have any good 19th century music on my iTunes account. So, as I noted last class, depending on how flexible your definition of the short story is, you can stretch it back to include fairy tales and fables. But the historical event that marks the appearance of the modern short story is the rise of the subscription based magazine, primarily in the 19th century, at least in the United States. So, magazines such as the North American Review, which was founded in 1815 and is still published today at UNI. It is the oldest magazine in America, so I got to make a shout out to them. And magazines like the Southern Literary Messenger, which Edgar Allan Poe edited, all made it possible, though difficult, for writers to make a living. And they provided a ready forum where American writers could get published, which was probably more significant in the long run. Now, these subscription based magazines were relatively expensive, and they tended to be read by an elite and an educated elite rather than by a mass audience. Now, one important subgroup of the subscription based magazine was the magazine designed for children, such as Youth's Companion, from which one of the stories for today first appeared. And I emphasize this because some historians have looked at the 18th and 19th centuries as the period during which childhood was invented. Now, that may sound odd at first, right? I mean, haven't there always been children? But in books such as Hugh Cunningham's The Invention of Childhood, the argument has been made for viewing childhood as a distinct developmental stage is actually historically recent. For a long time, children were viewed simply as imperfect adults who were in need of discipline and training so that they could then begin to take on adult responsibilities. The idea that children thought and developed in different ways than adults only gradually came to be accepted. But once it did, the culture developed to focus on children's perceived needs, including the need for instruction and guidance as seen in the story Self-Defense that we'll be discussing later. And then we'll have more to say about how Mark Twain kind of challenges some of the norms of the mid-19th century. But that'll be for class. Now that's the end of the movie, right? Now it is time for the audience participation part, or as we will also call it, class. So I'll see everyone on Wednesday. Please contact me if you have any trouble with the readings, or I suppose I can say if you've gotten this far, you've been able to view the video. Take care.